Okay, now, from the beginning.
Become the best instructor you're meant to be.
Exercise for a sense of community.
Founder and CEO of TRX.
You've done that. You've won somebody over forever.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to NASM Master Instructor Roundtable Live. My name is Prentiss, and I'm here with Wendy Batts and Marty Miller. How are you all doing this afternoon?
Great.
Great, thanks, Prentiss.
And behind the scenes, we have Greg, who's going to help us keep on moving today. So what we want to do today is talk about the importance of glute training. Everyone can see that on the title. Your glutes are the driver of that lower extremity, and it's going, proper training of your glutes is going to help you become strong and powerful in all of your athletic activities, and quite possibly get you into a Sir Mix-a-Lot video. So what you want to do is really focus in on those glutes when you're training. So Wendy, why don't you go ahead and tell us what we want to accomplish for today?
Sure. So we have actually a list of objectives that we're going to talk about. So we're going to review the functional anatomy of the glute muscles. We're going to highlight the human movement system concepts and factors that can impact the glute function and performance. And then we're going to go over practical skills of implementing simple, effective exercise strategies for improved multiplanar gluteal development, as well as strength and function. So basically, we are going to spend some time kind of talking about how do we know if the glutes are activating at its full potential, and then also ways to identify things based on not only just the transitional assessments, but also the mobility assessments. And then we're going to actually talk to you a little bit about this CES continuum, so the corrective exercise continuum. So therefore, we can get the glutes firing the way that they were intended to fire.
Okay, great. So with that, why don't we go ahead and why don't we get started and talk about why the glutes are important? We alluded to it in the beginning. You're going to become strong and powerful, but why is optimizing glute function so important, Marty?
Well, really, as you kind of alluded to at the beginning, it's the driver, the powerhouse, really the key driver for the lower body. But also, we'll talk a little bit, is it's got some importance, obviously, to the upper body as well, by keeping your pelvis in the right position. Again, if you want to burn a lot of calories, it's the largest muscle in your body by density. There's so many things that are so important for the glutes. We could talk about, lower body injuries, low back pain, etc. So a lot of people really have a focus now on a fitness standpoint, maybe more for cosmetics, but it's really such an important muscle from a functionality standpoint in performance. And whether you're a performance athlete, Wendy and I will use the term that everybody's an athlete, whether you're performing for activities of daily living or you're performing at the highest level, the glutes are going to play a very important role in helping you perform as well as reducing injury if they're functioning properly.
Okay, great. Wendy, do you have anything to add to the importance of glute function?
Well, I mean, obviously, to me, that's the most important complex I feel when I'm working with my clients. I'm very adamant about trying to get the glutes to fire, and because, again, that's going to help maintain proper neutral position of the hips, which obviously we need, thinking about the kinetic chain just all together. So if somebody has an anterior pelvic tilt, think about the low back pain, think about the decreased glute activation, the increased lengthening of the hamstrings. And that's a lot of what we're going to cover in the next couple slides. How do you identify it? And if someone comes with low back pain and you see just an anterior pelvic tilt, you can truly help them get out of pain right away by knowing how to identify it and then the corrective exercise strategies to fix that.
And that's great. And you're going to talk a little bit more about corrective exercise and how weakness in the glute may cause impairments and other challenges in the movement system for your clients. But in the industry, there's popular terms running around out there called leakage and linkage. And Marty, you alluded to that. How does the glute, I'm telling you it's there. I heard it 2 years ago, I swear. But if your glute isn't functioning, how does that affect power transfer between your lower and upper body? How does that affect you? Just speak to the things that we have there in that slide, landing, jumping, sprinting, what's happening there.
Yeah, this is a great slide. So first of all, the picture there, you can see the knees caving in or going into that valgus position. And the glutes by themselves, it's not the only reason that is happening, but the glutes are going to play a predominant role in preventing that from happening. And you can see here just a few key points of the studies that reduced glute activation can be correlated with pain in all lower extremities joints, and that could include the hip, knee, SI joint, ankle, and then the last bullet here, and then we'll talk about what you were commenting on is having greater gluteal strength can then be correlated with better landing, running, and squatting, or just being athletic. And improve movement quality, which is important for every single one of our clients, even if they don't aspire to that higher level of athleticism. And then first and foremost, athletic trainer. So I'm always trying to reduce injuries. We know that having good glute function will reduce a lot of those lower extremity injuries, especially ACLs. Wendy and I were talking, she's like, where do you want to talk about that? I'm like, well, it'll come up somewhere. And, I had a feeling Prentiss, you teed this up for me. So Wendy knows So that's why I didn't plan it. I didn't have to plan what slide. So
we only got 2 slides in before it happened. So
exactly. So, what I see now in the gym is everybody is targeting their glutes, and that's great. It became a bigger focus over the last handful of years, and that's awesome. At least they're, getting off of back in the day, they used to do hundreds of crunches, so now there's other different trends in fitness. But when I was teaching this a while back, last year, and I had this aha moment. I think people confuse hypertrophy with pure control and motor function or proper motor function. Somebody could have cosmetically great hypertrophy in their glutes. That doesn't mean they have ideal strength in their glutes in correlation to the rest of their movement system. So let me pause there and get back to this. Another thing that I always say is capacity and ability. Everyone has, the human capacity for strength and all this and power. So just because somebody has developed incredible glute strength or hypertrophy doesn't mean they still couldn't be better if they had ideal movement throughout their kinetic chain. So I've seen people do hip thrusters and all these glute exercises, and they're compensating everywhere. And yes, they're moving heavy weight. And yes, cosmetically, they've seen a change. But that doesn't mean if I did an overhead squat with them, they still wouldn't have an anterior pelvic tilt, knees cave in, all the things from a weak glute, equally to somebody else who has no glute, hypertrophy and might be a lot weaker in those exercises, but they're both moving dysfunctionally because proportionally they have movement compensation. So somebody has great hypertrophy could be more powerful in their movement dysfunction, but the movement dysfunction can still be there. So that kind of comes into that leakage. And, I don't know if that's exactly where you were heading. I'm going to pause there to see if there's if I explained it hopefully correctly, because I think people get far too much credit just from the way those muscles are developed and look, thinking that they don't need to maybe think about what we're going to cover with better activation and strategies behind how to get the glutes to function better.
No, that's exactly where I was going with that. Function is important. You do have one aspect of function, which is strength, but also having those muscles to be reactive to their environment. Your glute's going to help you decelerate and change direction quickly, which, as you both know, that's where a lot of those injuries you're talking about occur. You know, the glute isn't working as a brake like it should for, for some of those movements. So that being able to react to the environment, stabilize, and then fire concentrically to change directions into its proper function is something that's definitely important for the overall function of the muscle. So we're
Wendy and I've already talked about this when we were putting this together. There was so much great content that we're like, you know what, let's kind of separate it. We'll get through, so there is a second part coming, and we'll talk more about what happens in the gym. And that's kind of what I'm seeing. I was in there today and I saw, prepping for this webinar. I'm like, okay, I see what they're trying to do. I see what they're trying to do. And I saw feet turn out, a low back arch, and they were moving a lot of weight. So, and they probably felt it in their glutes. But once we go through the science, I think people could see even better results and maybe even get quicker, stronger, more powerful, whatever, once they understand what Wendy and I are going to dissect through the rest.
Okay, so we have 3 glute muscles. Let's talk about what they do. Let's start out with the big one, gluteus maximus. Wendy, entertain us.
Well, this is, like you said, this is the big one. And, this is kind of the powerhouse. But, so concentrically accelerates hip extension. So remember, we have anywhere from like 10 to 15 degrees of hip extension, or we should have that. That's ideal. And then abduction, so leg going out, and then external rotation. And eccentrically, it's going to decelerate the complete opposite. So hip flexion, adduction, as well as internal rotation. So basically what the glutes do is we're trying to, anything that when your leg is going back, your glute max should be involved. And it's also going to stabilize the lumbopelvic hip complex. So that's pretty much what we just wanted to touch very quickly on the anatomy part of it and show you kind of a quick picture because, obviously there's 3 main areas we're going to talk about when we're talking about the glutes, but we really want to spend a lot of time too talking about the assessments as well as some ways to really get the glutes to fire. Okay.
All right. Thanks. So we're talking about the muscle fiber type, and I see that you have written here that it's predominantly type 1. Now, some people will say, just within the industry, people say glutes, that's your type 2 muscle, that's your deadlift muscle, that's your big muscle. What can you explain that? Why it's written as type 1 muscle?
You want me to jump in there, Wendy?
Go ahead, Marty. Yeah, go ahead, Marty.
Either way, it doesn't matter. Yeah.
So when you look at it, remember how I said earlier, it's one of the densest or by volume and density. So every muscle will have some type 1 and type 2 characteristics. It's what's predominant. If you think about it, the glutes are a huge stabilizer to our pelvis if they're working properly. Yes, they do a lot of really fun, cool, and exciting things, but they do them for prolonged periods of time. So there's so much density that there's a lot of muscle fiber there. So you can pick up heavier loads than you might attribute to compared to a bicep. They're just not even close to the same amount of volume of fibers. So don't confuse how powerful it can be. That has to always be type 2, because we couldn't run a marathon properly, right? If we didn't have good glute activation, we couldn't stand up for hours upon hours upon hours. So you'll see there, though, we do want to mix the intensity and repetition range. And we do that always. I always go back. The model is your best friend. We always talk about, as Wendy will say, the 5Ks, the 5 kinetic chain checkpoints. If you have them in order through all 3 phases, you're going to be getting glutes through all 3 phases. So you're going to get the endurance in the first 2 phases. You're going to get the strength in, the hypertrophy and the max strength, and then you're going to get power. So you're going to work it all. But don't forget that it is there for endurance to be able to do these things for prolonged periods of time.
Yes, absolutely. You probably get through maybe 1,600 meters of that marathon. It was strictly.
Imagine if that was strictly right. Imagine if your glutes were type 2, we would struggle.
Yeah, absolutely. So now let's talk about the glute medius. What does the glute medius do? What's its function? So let's take a, there you go. Glute medius.
Go back one, Greg. So when we're talking about the glute medius, as you can see in the picture where it is, it can, concentrically. So it's going to accelerate hip abduction internal rotation when you're talking about the anterior fibers. And then when you're also thinking about, it's going to also, accelerate hip abduction and external when you're talking about the posterior fibers. And so again, when we are actually going through the assessment process, the anterior and posterior fibers are going to be really important here, because again, the glute medius does a lot of different things. And so eccentrically, it decelerates hip adduction, hip flexion, internal rotation. And Marty, I don't know if you want to add anything to that. I mean, again, this is just kind of basic functionality. So therefore, hopefully our programming makes a little more sense.
Yeah, Wendy did an amazing job as always explaining it. So this is that open chain. That's how we learn anatomy, like if we're a cadaver on a table. But from a functional standpoint, it really helps to stabilize the pelvis and the knee. So that's where when we see that adduction and the knee caving in or the pelvis having issues, obviously something's not stabilizing and keeping it where it needs to be. So, in a closed chain, it's going to have a lot of stability in the pelvis, especially in that frontal plane component to it.
Okay, that is pretty that's pretty clear. I'm going to ask you a question later regarding integration when we talk about corrective exercise. So I'm going to hold my question, Wendy.
Okay.
Now let's talk about what the glute minimus does.
Sure. So concentrically accelerates hip abduction, so leg going out, flexion, and internal rotation, which again, eccentrically, is going to decelerate hip adduction, extension, as well as external rotation. And again, you can see that all three of these are going to stabilize the lumbo-pelvic hip complex. That's why they are all three very, very important.
Okay. Marty, do you have anything to add to that? Okay. So let's get into it. The people who are listening want to know how to identify when the glute goes wrong. Let's talk through our assessments and then eventually get into a little programming.
Sure. So when Marty and I sat down, we were talking about, well, what are the primary assessments that we do pretty much with everyone, and what are some key factors that usually we see? And again, not everyone's different, so every body is different. But when we're thinking about relative assessments, we look at the overhead squat assessment. Again, that's our go-to for pretty much every single individual that walks through our doors. The single leg squat, again, if it can be performed safely. And then we would look a little bit deeper to see if what it's mainly like confirmation, if you will, on the mobility assessments. And, here we would probably perform the hip extension, so the Thomas test. And remember that if you're lacking glute activation, and it's not firing correctly, there's going to be altered link tension relationship and synergistic dominance, which means basically the hamstrings are going to be overworked. And when you're looking at that test, you're going to be able to determine, how tight are the hip flexors, and do you have hip extension, considering that's a primary, that's primary function of what the actual glutes do is hip extension. We would also look at, I would say, both internal and external rotation of the hip. Again, that's just to kind of, 45 degrees is the most ideal if you have a goniometer. Okay, not just a goni, but a goniometer. But if you're looking at the new CES, we've given you some visual tools to determine how much motion is in that leg and if the hip is actually rotating to almost ideal. And again, if you're lacking internal rotation, there's potential overactivity in the piriformis, the adductor magnus, and the bicep femoris. And then again, if we keep going down the list and we talk about hip abduction, so you're laying, you've got your client laying in a supine position and you're looking at hip abduction. If the adductors are tight, it's going to lead to reciprocal inhibition of the glute medius, which we just talked about. Again, a huge stabilizer of the lumbo-pelvic hip complex. And then lastly, and again, there's a ton of other, you could do any one. These are the ones that Marty and I thought would be the most, that would reveal the most, but knee extension at a 90-90. And if the hip is, if hip extension is limited, if the knee extension is limited and hip extension, God, I can't even talk, and hip extension is also limited, then it's going to indicate that the hamstrings are also synergistically dominant. So again, ideal range of motion is anywhere from 0 to 20 when you're looking at knee extension. So, people often ask, well, is there a correlation? If your glutes are not activated properly, is there a correlation to the knee? And the answer to that is absolutely yes.
Okay. So let's back up a little bit. And I know we've talked about this in past webinars, but what are we going to see with our overhead squat and single leg squat to inform us of which of these mobility assessments we're going to use? What are we looking for?
Well, I even started the foot and ankle complex. Very often the feet will externally rotate. The knees, you'll have knee valgus, so the knees are going to shoot in, and as well as an anterior pelvic tilt, which then again with the anterior pelvic tilt would also show the arms falling forward. Again, the arms falling forward and the anterior tilt, that's usually a lat thing. However, if you're looking at common compensations and putting it around, again, it all kind of starts at the foot and ankle and then works its way up. Because remember, if your feet are turning out and your knees kind of shoot in a little bit and you've got an anterior pelvic tilt, all the muscles that we just talked about that's stabilizing the hip are obviously not in its ideal location and position. And whether it started at the hip and worked its way down to the ankle or started at the foot and ankle and worked its way up. Again, that's why the kinetic chain, it's all interconnected one way or another, and it affects one joint to another working from top to bottom.
Okay. All right. Perfect. And also I know that all of us we've worked with unicorns and workshops who say, I have no glute dysfunction, and they can squat. There's no knee valgus, no heel, no feet turning out, but just a tremendous arch. And I think standing on one leg, a nice gentle breeze could blow them over. So can you talk about some of the other, I know you touched on it briefly. Just talk about some of the other things that you see when your anterior view of your squat appears normal.
So, well, again, if it's appearing normal when someone's standing there, that's one thing. But if you're truly looking at them through an assessment and their shoes are off, there's nothing there other than the ground, their feet, and you're having them go through the overhead squat assessment, it's going to be very obvious in a majority of people who have dysfunction, obviously, in their glutes as well as an anterior pelvic tilt. Me personally, I used to say, oh, I don't have a tilt, I just have a big booty. And that's not the case. I had a huge tilt, but I played it off as that, and what ends up happening is you want to think about reciprocal inhibition. Is basically your hips should be in a neutral position. If your ASIS bones are pointing down, so you're actually think about a pail of water and think about your hips pouring the water out the front. What ends up happening is it shortens the hip flexor complex. And bis and tris, remember, if you shorten your bicep, the tricep has to lengthen. So reciprocal inhibition, if you shorten your hip flexors, the glutes they'll also go into a lengthened position. So if you do that, your two synergists, which means helpers of the glute max or the glute complex, would be your hamstrings would be in a lengthened position, and your lower back. So basically, you're thinking about your lumbar spine and all the muscles that attach to it. Those muscles are also going to be in a very shortened position as well. So you're basically causing a lot of pressure on the lumbar spine. It can affect your SI joint, which is basically right around your sacrum, and which will also limit rotation, movement, and that's when people start to get low back pain. So I don't know if I answered your question in a very long-winded answer, but yeah, if you've got an arch, your glutes are not firing properly.
Yes, it just speaks to we tend to look sometimes at the low-hanging fruit. And yes, if people can't fake it, and I'm speaking of athletic, some of our more athletic population, they can fake some of the feet turning out and knees caving in. But when you get them doing the squat, their body doesn't lie.
Yep.
Right.
And you will see things like, low back arch. You will see things if they can squat on 2 feet, just not having motor control when they're on one leg. So there are other things that you can look for.
And Prentiss, going back to the part that I talked about, how, yes, it is predominantly type 1 muscle fiber types. What I tend to see a lot as an athletic trainer and now watching what goes on in high intensity is people that are very, very fit. They might be able to do 10 or 12 body squats and look okay. But all of a sudden, 25 minutes, 30 minutes into a class, or how many times do we have runners go, you know what, I'm out for a run, and right around the 3 mile mark, that's when my knee starts to hurt or things. Not saying it's always due to glutes, but I can tell you as an athletic trainer, whenever there's low back or dysfunction on the way down, I'm going to be checking the glutes throughout all the other things I might be looking at. And more times than not, there is going to be some dysfunction, and it's not always just the strength, because a lot of people out in the gym are doing 8 to 10 reps, heavy weight, but they haven't really got to fire properly and be able to do the endurance component of what we really need in the glutes, especially in an integrated way. And this is where sometimes I think people don't truly understand what's going on because they quote unquote hit their glutes.
Okay, so let's dive a little bit deeper and talk about what happens when the glute performance is impaired. Marty, why don't you start with that?
Absolutely. So this is that Thomas test, a great test to do, very easy to do. And what we're looking at is the ability to get into hip extension. So, you really want at least neutral, where the knee and hip are parallel, but you generally see sometimes the knee is higher than that. And you can see here, and the individual on the right was able to go further. So some great research here, 60% less glute max activation during functional squat tasks, 2.6 times greater bicep femoris activity relative to the glute max. So again, something's going to take over. Something's going to work harder. You're going to squat, you're going to jump, you're going to run, you're going to land, you're going to do that activity. You're not stopping. Like no one says, oh, my glute didn't fire, let me stop it here. Now, maybe if you're training with us, we'll give you a modification. But, you can see that, and that shows the science behind the altered reciprocal inhibition and their synergistic dominance when you don't have ideal range of motion of your hips. So it's so crucial to get that good range of motion in your hip before you move into the progressions that we do in the model.
Yeah, and this Mills article, if you guys are research nerds like Marty and I, it's like one of my favorite because it kind of validates everything that NASM is about. Like we want to always provide research, and it's not something that we sit at home and we try to make stuff up. We want to actually make sure that we're validated in what we're saying. And so if you guys really enjoy research, this is a great article talking about the importance of looking at assessments first and then being able to identify, a corrective strategy in order to limit some of these compensations that are going to lead to even greater issues down the road.
Right. Awesome. So when we talk about synergistic dominance, you mentioned the hamstring, but what are some of the other muscles in the area that fight for dominance of the hip? What are some of the muscles at play that can also become synergistically dominant?
Gotcha. Well, two main ones for sure will be your low back extension, your low back extenders, as well as the piriformis. So this is where when people squat, they feel it in their low back, or again, the piriformis is not designed to be a strength-based muscle. So if the glute medius aren't doing their job, what's left, deep within the hip, piriformis will try to do its job to either stabilize and or assist. And that's where a lot of people can end up with, that deep kind of pain deep underneath the glute, or sometimes even sciatic pain as well, because the sciatic nerve either runs next to or through that piriformis muscle. So if it gets tight, it can really constrict that sciatic nerve.
Okay. Anything to add to that, Wendy?
No, I mean, to Marty's point, and the piriformis, they always, people make fun of it and call it the enormous piriformis because it's really small, but people train it like it should be a gigantic glute max muscle. And the problem with that, like Marty said, is you got to think about, the fact of where it is on the sacrum and then where it goes through, like Marty just said too, with the sciatic nerve. That's one muscle you want to kind of give a break. So if you have a client that's coming in and feeling some numbness, tingling, or whatever, we don't, that's out of our scope. However, if you put them on a foam roller, a lot of time they get instant relief because it's really that piriformis that's just sitting and compressing on that. Okay. So just wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah. So if you're looking, I'm going to do some finger weaving. Basically looks like this. So if you have your sacrum there or your piriformis, your sacrum, here's your sciatic nerve. Can everyone see that?
There it is.
There it is right there. Trust me, if you go to your anatomy textbook, it's going to look exactly like that. So now that you made the case for the glutes, let's talk through the corrective exercise continuum.
Perfect. Again, your assessments are going to determine exactly what muscles you need to inhibit, lengthen, activate, integrate. There's no changes in that. And again, the mobility ones, if you're new to that, those are just confirming what you saw in the overhead squat and single leg squat. So you don't have to actually do the mobility assessments yet. I mean, it is something I think that's great for your toolbox. And I think NASM has done a really good job on the new mobility tests for people that are not used to using the goniometer. So again, whatever is showing to be overactive, and you'll start to see a lot of the common muscles are the exact same things you're going to see over and over again. So feet going out, knees in, anterior tilt, arms forward. You're going to foam roll those, then you're going to statically stretch those. And then, of course, as always, you're going to activate the muscles that have shown to be lengthened and weak, and then put it all together in an integration exercise or two.
Okay. So now that's perfect. That's, if you haven't seen this, you should go right now and get the corrective exercise text and study that. That'll teach you everything that we've been talking about for quite a while now. So now that we've established the corrective exercise continuum, what are some of those variables that the trainer should look at when we're programming according to our assessment findings? Go ahead, Marty.
Sure. So the key thing is, no matter what webinar we've talked about, I'm going to say here, is we're always trying to reestablish proper human movement. That is the fundamental basis of what the model's built on. Corrective exercise can be the start of it, or the stabilization phase. If you do not move well, you shouldn't move well. You shouldn't move under load, and you shouldn't move at high speeds. Very simple. I mean, that is the model at a 40,000 foot level. So when we look at the variables here, we're just trying to reestablish that neural drive to weaker inhibited muscles, so we get those firing patterns. I like to say we generally don't train muscles, we train movements. You know, we could be training hip abduction or whatever, but we're training movements, and sometimes you're isolating a muscle, but we want to get towards that integration as quick as possible and get everything communicating well together. So you can see here, we're using that third step as a warm-up to program that increase that intramuscular coordination. So there's intramuscular, which means we're somewhat targeting an individual muscle or a very small group of muscles, where intermuscular coordination would be that part where we're getting everybody moving well together, like a step up to balance, a squat to row. So intramuscular, we're working on a very small muscle or group of muscles to get them fired back up so they can do their job. As we've always said, and we were just talking about not too long ago, I'm still going to squat, whether my glute's firing at the right rate or not. My bicep femoris might kick in, my piriformis might kick in, my erector spinae may kick in. So what we're trying to do is get the targeted muscles to do their role, so those other muscles can take a break, and we start again establishing better movement. So that will restore better 5 kinetic chain checkpoints, our muscle balances around those affected joints. Definitely will enhance the stability of those joints, and then improve the strength control through a greater range of motion. So going back to our friends in the gym that are looking for that glute hypertrophy, they're getting it by moving incorrectly. Imagine what we could get them if they actually fired these muscles properly in the right sequence. So maybe there's more gains that they can still establish. So that's why, again, we're going to always go back to getting people to move properly.
So this is more of a philosophical question for both. This is for both of you. Someone who comes in with that appearance of strength, they have the strength, they're moving, they're doing hip thrusts with upward of 500 pounds. How do you make the case to reestablish that neural drive if you've identified that they're compensating?
Gotcha. Well, for me, and I'm sure Wendy has some amazing approaches too. No matter who I'm training, no matter what the goal is, I'm going to bring it back to the model. But what helps me is, why are they working out? Why are they exercising? What is the most important thing to them? Is it improving their vertical jump? Is it decreasing low back pain? Is it losing weight? Is it gaining muscle mass? Any goal you give me, I will be able to come back to, well, imagine what happens when we restore proper movement. I get all these muscles firing properly. The answer doesn't change, because the research for 20 plus years has shown that we get better results by doing it this way. So I just wait till I find out what the most important thing for them is, And then I show how through the science, I'm going to get them there quicker, more efficiently, and maybe even better. That's kind of the strategy I look at.
Okay. And Wendy, what's your strategy?
I mean, it's pretty much the same thing. I think a lot of times we just go into too much detail with our clients. I mean, we want to basically say, hey, we want to restore your proper movement to get you out of pain, or we're going to try to make you more powerful, but we've got to fix some correct some issues that I'm seeing in your movement pattern. And again, not everyone's going to be fixed. So, we're not saying that, we're the creator of all humans, right? I mean, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get better movement patterns, get people out of pain, and get them more powerful or stronger, or whatever their end goal is. And so, I want to stress that when we're talking about like fixing everyone. We're not trying to fix everyone. We're trying to get them to move better so they perform better. And I think that's just it. Like Marty said, it's like, basically try to get them in the best alignment, ideal, proper kinetic chain checkpoints, alignment. If you do that, you're going to have better prime mover activation, if you will. You're going to decrease compensations, decrease the synergistic dominance and altered reciprocal inhibition, blah, 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 blah. I mean, just put them back into ideal form, get things firing the way that it should. And don't go too much into the science. I think that's like with the client, you need to have the science for sure, but don't overthink it. Just find the assessments and then go to what you know.
Okay, perfect. So now we all know that moving well is the difference between not being hurt. It's also the difference between winning and losing. Let's talk about precision in movement and why that's so important. Let's go, Marty.
Certainly. So again, we're looking at improving quality movement throughout anybody that we're working with. So you'll see here, precision exercise execution is paramount. And we're going to, say typically single joint and or less complex movements are best. I always say earn the right to go to the next level. So whether you look at you're aspiring to be, some of these really high intensity type of training programs or multi-joint exercise that you see in CrossFit, we can reverse engineer those down to very simple progressions that eventually now you've moved towards that. You don't just start at that highest level. We wouldn't do that in, Prentiss, you and I are big martial arts, practitioners and fans. You don't roll into a dojo and go find the 3rd degree black belt and start sparring with that individual generally. You earn your right.
You'll do it once.
Yeah, you learn quickly. Think about how we teach our kids. It's kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade. So why we need to do that in exercise. Now, it doesn't mean we can't make it fun. Doesn't mean we can't make it engaging. But we're going to work on a progression to get them towards those more complex things. If they can't control very precise, single joint exercises, how are they going to handle it 3-dimensionally when their whole body's moving, especially if they're moving load and quickly? So again, we can absolutely make this into a fun workout session. Maybe that'll be some of the stuff Wendy and I cover, once we get to the other part of it that's not so science-based. So simple to complex, and, resistance movement must directly oppose muscles, line of pull and action. So again, that's where, if you know your anatomy, if you know what a muscle does, you know how to then resistance in the opposite direction. So you can target that muscle more specifically. For example, if I wanted to increase the strength or endurance of my anterior tibialis muscle, it's dorsiflexion with inversion, which means if I want to strengthen it, I need to apply resistance from a plantar flex everted pattern so I can pull into dorsiflexion inversion. If I do that, I'll get a better outcome than if I just did simple dorsiflexion. So that's where knowing the anatomy, knowing how muscles function, you can then reverse engineer it and figure out how to load those movements in ideal ways, so you get a better execution and a better muscle contraction, which means now the body can learn those patterns and then execute that once you get into those integrating type of movements. So clearly no compensations. If we, I always, say people are saying, well, I need a couple cheat reps. Well, if you're cheating, that means you're telling your body that this pattern is okay to replicate. So if I'm allowing you to cheat or compensate, I am now making you stronger in those compensations. So that's why Wendy and I and Prentiss, I know you're the same way. It's either perfect or it's not. Progress, regress it, but make sure the execution is as little as compensation as possible. So that way they eventually can execute that proper motion in real life.
So just for clarity on that last statement, I found that very interesting. Yeah, because myself, I'm on the wrong business end of 40. So I just wanted to clarify cheat reps. I use a limited range of motion with precise form until I acquire my full range of motion. Is that what we're talking about when we're saying cheat reps, or are we?
Nope. I'm talking about the old bodybuilding days when you and I grew up, where you're just throwing the whole body into it to get that extra volume. Because, you know, so we used to do that a lot with bicep curls, right? You'd go to fatigue. And again, I'm sure there was other compensations because we didn't know about our 5 kinetic chain checkpoints. But once the bicep fatigued, you'd start just kind of hurling it back up there. Well, now you're not doing a bicep curl or elbow flexion anymore. You're doing almost like a kettlebell swing. So we want to make sure that the execution is perfect. If I need to limit the range of motion, like the depth of a squat, until I increase joint mobility, increase hip mobility, nothing wrong with that. But we're not going to allow compensation like a low back arch or feet turnout during that. We would modify the depth until compensation occurs, or the range of motion.
Okay.
Yep. And then obviously last 2 things here on this slide, tempo is critically important. If you want to improve endurance, you know our tempo is that 4-2-1. If you are in the strength phase, then we go to 2-0-2 or the XXX. So tempo has to be what the science tells us to for that phase of training. And then clearly we're going to focus on eccentric and isometric, especially early on, while we're trying to teach the body how to control motion and reduce or decelerate. So that way, when we get into our more high explosive plyometrics, the body knows how to act as a braking mechanism. So things are, going to go on in a lot safer and more controlled manner.
Yeah, definitely. When you're trying to learn that and balancing that with more intense reps at high speed or high load, that is the absolute wrong time to be thinking about that. You want to do that. That's why the model is set up the way it is. You want to take care of that stuff and teach the body in phase 1 so that you can feed forward all of that information into your higher yield activities, strength or high load and high speed. Absolutely. Okay. So Wendy, teach us how to warm up. How are we going to get warmed up and flexible so that we can do all that stuff that Marty was talking about?
Now, when we put this together, we were being very generalized. Obviously, we didn't give you guys like, okay, here's the assessment results and everything like that. We were just saying, here are some common overactive muscles. Again, your assessment should dictate what muscles you should inhibit and lengthen. So please keep that in mind. But, usually when the glutes aren't firing to their full potential, the bicep femoris is going to be overactive, as well as the adductor magnus and TFL and rectus femoris. So at that point, you would grab a foam roller and you could foam roll those areas. Or if you have like a hypervolt or some kind of percussion device that you could use to try to inhibit those muscles, those are the muscles that we would tell you to focus on, and then immediately go into statically stretching. Again, because we're not getting, people are like, oh, you're trying to overstretch these muscles. No, we're trying to get length back into optimal length back into those muscles to make sure that the joint, that the muscles on each side, the joints are in proper alignment and moving correctly. So again, we would statically stretch, holding 20 to 30 seconds. The hip flexor complex, again, remember in the assessment, you would probably see the anterior pelvic tilt, which would also tell you then again the bicep femoris as well as the adductor magnus.
Okay, so now that we've done that, let's activate those glutes. Let's get them going so that we're ready to drive down Broadway. Tell us what we do.
Well, as the continuum says, again, you're going to inhibit first, you're going to lengthen. So we're talking about the muscles, again, that were found to be overactive. But now we needed to really focus in on the muscles that were weak and allowed those compensations. And so usually if you're looking at just the CES, or if you're just trying to focus solely on, let's say, an anterior pelvic tilt, these are some awesome exercises that you could do to help re-engage some of the muscles that have shown to be very underactive. And so some of the ones that Marty and I both really like are the banded clamshells. So basically you're laying on your side, you've got a band around your knees and you're coming up and down nice and slow. Again, that's, you could do the lateral tube walking as well, really kind of focusing on the glute medius. as well as we've got the side-lying hip abductor or abduction. Again, you're going to think that the foot, when you're laying on your side, the foot will be in neutral, or there could be slight internal rotation. Again, oftentimes people might externally rotate, and you want to be careful with that, because think about the piriformis that we just discussed earlier, and we want to kind of let that guy have a break. And so that's one of the reasons for that positioning. And then again, band resisted prone hip extension with slight hip abduction, and then floor, which are of course my go-to every time, the floor or the ball bridge. And if you want to put the band around the knees, you can as well. But again, we're trying to activate those muscles that have shown to be underactive based on the compensations.
Okay. Now, Marty, take us through some of those, your favorite strength training.
Yeah, these are just some of the integration techniques. There's plenty more to choose from. So this is not a complete list, but it's a nice list to work off of. So the band resisted single leg balance with any type of reach progression, going through all three planes of motion, of course, sagittal, frontal, and transverse with the opposite leg than your balanced leg. Lateral band stepping, again, with the lateral bands, I'm careful on getting them, too quick, too early, because a lot of people start to rock and roll and they get going too fast. Remember, these are endurance muscles that we're talking about. So I want someone to get in that quarter squat position, own that, athletic position, take a step and pause. Step and pause. I want them to stay low. I want, I see people flying through the band walking. Form and technique can go south, and then they're really not working the endurance of those muscles. The forward backward band stepping is great as well. Lunge, lunge matrix, so lunge with reach matrix or single leg Romanian deadlifts, I absolutely love. Key thing, guys, keep that core nice and stable. It's like a plank up top as you're doing that Romanian deadlift, slow and controlled. Lateral hop to hold. The key thing is there's the hold. We want that nice landing and that stabilization. And then front to back hops as well. So again, we're working through all plane motion and really teaching the glute complex in integration with the core, of course, and communicating with the foot and ankle, how to really land, keep our 5 kinetic chain checkpoints in order, and not lose that neutral position of the pelvis, knee, and then obviously the foot and ankle.
And I'm glad that you spoke to the control that's necessary for the lateral band stepping, because often when I see that happen in the gym, it looks like kind of like a Frankenstein walk, or, if your leg has gone to sleep, you have to use your QL to kind of like lift your pelvis and swing that leg forward. And that's how I see sometimes the band walks executed.
And one of the things that drives me nuts, sorry to interrupt, Prentiss, is if I step out with my right, if I'm not paying attention to my left leg, it gets pulled into adduction. Mm-hmm. So it's like what I teach my clients is I teach them the first how to step with the lead leg. Then I say, okay, I don't want you to focus on it anymore. I want you to and I get them to contract in the opposite direction with the trail leg so it doesn't get pulled into adduction. Because I was watching people in the gym today, their pelvis was all over the place. And again, they're so focused on stepping out, there's no focus on how that trail leg, which the glute medius should be stabilizing it as that resistance pulls against it. I'm really focused on that trail leg. So that's where sometimes we just do a step to hold. We don't even get people walking yet. I want them to focus. If I step out, are both legs staying in neutral? One is producing force while the other one is reducing force. So that's where I think people just jump to the band way too fast and maybe don't realize that they're actually creating some compensations there.
And I think also that speaks to the what you just described there speaks to the principles of integration. Yes, we're focused. We're definitely focused on that muscle that's moving, that lead leg that's moving into abduction, but this is an integrated movement. You have something trailing that also requires some motor control. So you have to focus on the entirety of the body when you're doing any of these movements. Wendy, before we get to our takeaways, do you have anything to add to this point?
Well, I could talk about tube walking all day, because my big pet peeve is the teapot, like their body goes, it's like a bad, bad dance move. It's like a worm, right? Yes, like the side worm or something. But yeah, so just remember, all together, like as you move, your body should stay lined up with the leg that's walking out. And then the other one, as Marty says, don't cave in, don't do the Michael Jackson slide, just pick it up, side to side and continue to walk. So, but yeah, so that's just my take on that. But overall too, again, because we gave you guys a lot of options, I don't want people to feel like, because when we talk about, we said this is more of the CES version of how to try to get activation in the glutes. If you're thinking about programming, I really want to emphasize that you would pick anywhere between, let's say 2 to 4 things to inhibit, 2 to 4 things to lengthen. You would probably choose 2 or 3 activations and then 1 to 2 integration. So you wouldn't take all of this and then try to apply it into a phase of training, because we've done a lot of different webinars on how to do hybrids, and the CES should be kind of integrated into some of your programming. It's just we realized that this would take well over an hour. We just wanted to give you guys some ideas of things that you could do to truly get those small muscles as well as the glute max to fire at the full potential before you got into the actual workout component of whatever it is you're doing with your client.
And also for everyone listening, I hope you appreciate that Wendy and Marty gave you the secret decoder ring to figure out that you don't have to do these exercises that they've listed here. You understand the functional anatomy, so you have an idea, even right down to how those fibers are shaped. You know what their individual and integrated movements are. You know what you're looking for in the overhead squat assessment.
Yes.
So now you understand the anatomy. You know what you're looking for in the assessment, and if you adhere to the principles, you want to move, you want to strengthen that underactive muscle in its plane of movement, within its isolated function and also with its integrated function. You can do anything as long as you adhere to those principles. So they gave you the keys.
Yes.
Okay. So now, while we're waiting for some questions to come through, and please ask questions, you have both of these smart individuals for a whole hour once a week. Please ask questions. Make sure you get all of your questions answered. But let's start with your takeaways. Wendy.
Well, again, I think the most important thing that we say every single week is that your assessments are key. Find out, how is the client moving? Find out anything about their history. Is there certain areas that have been injured, broken? Because again, a lot of that plays a part in how you're going to program anything that you're working on with your client. Again, follow the science. NASM gave you the OPT model, just apply it. It's really that simple, because they are the whole purpose of the model is it's evidence and scientifically researched, it's evidence-based and scientifically researched. So we've done a lot of the research and science behind it. You just have to apply it, and then always maintain proper alignment. Don't let the client's foot even slightly turn out. Don't let them have any kind of anterior pelvic tilt. Remember, there is a natural curve in the spine, so it's not like we're asking you to keep your back completely straight, because there is a normal curve, but there's a difference between normal and then hypo. So, or hyper, sorry. So again, you don't want too much of an anterior pelvic tilt. You want to really try to keep it in neutral. And I think if you do that, and then you really look at the CES, inhibit what's overactive, activate what's underactive, and then put it into integration, meaning put it all together, and you will see success in cleaning up some of those compensations that you saw throughout the assessment.
Okay, Marty, I'll give you the last word. Takeaways.
I agree with Wendy. And then the only thing I'll add to that is, seriously, I make every exercise I do a core and glute exercise. Remember, if our core, we chop off our arms and legs, our glutes would be there. So what I mean by that is I'm always finding neutral. I'm always drawing in. I'm always getting my glutes activated before I do anything, even if I'm not targeting those muscles. I could be doing a strength phase upper body chest press, and I'm still, before I start that press, I find neutral, draw in, and I squeeze the glutes to stabilize my spine. Every single exercise, I should be dialing in that before I perform it. Biceps, triceps, doesn't matter. Then clearly we have our targeted glute exercises. But if you get into that mindset that every single thing is a glute and core stabilization level exercise, accidental exercise starts to build the endurance of it. And now your body's always keying in, which if we get those things going, our form and technique is going to clean up very quickly that way as well.
Okay. So now if there are, I think we had some questions. And this question comes from Matt. Thank you for joining us today, Matt. And Matt wants to know, could a lack of glute strength and flexibility cause a knee problem? Marty.
Yes. So for a lot of different reasons, remember there's multiple knee problems. So if you're having any type of knee pain, you absolutely might want to seek medical attention. Now, for some reason, if you foam roll, static stretch, and start activating your glutes and everything clears up, keep an eye on it. But again, we're not here to treat pain. And every knee issue is not the same. There's countless different knee injuries, but the glutes control where that knee is going to track. Now, there's things that go on the foot and ankle as well, but if you do not have good glute activation, you are absolutely going to have problems with the knee, especially if you're trying to do any type of running, jumping, heavy lifting. For sure, that's going to even increase those chances. So go through your assessment, see what the overhead squat assessment tells you. If you're having knee problems, seek medical attention, but you're going to go right back to your assessment, go through the phases of training, and then hopefully that clears up very quickly for you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Marty. And this next question comes from Peter. So thank you again for watching with us today, Peter. Peter wants to know, how can you determine the difference between needing glute activation or abductor IT band TFL weakness? Wendy.
Yeah, so this one's kind of a difficult question because again, this is when I think the mobility assessments really do come into play. Because ideally, if you can, and again, even if you're not familiar with the goniometer, I think that the NASM CES mobility assessments are fantastic. Because the thing is in your overhead squat assessment, if someone has an anterior pelvic tilt, that would really be a huge indicator that the glutes are not activating to their full potential. Again, there is some activation. So we don't want to say like your butt isn't working. That's not what we mean. It's just it's not working the way that it was intended to work. And there are other muscles that should be doing something different that are actually helping the glutes get that job done. And so, again, when you're thinking about abductors and IT bands, if you have an anterior pelvic tilt, based on, remember, an anterior pelvic tilt helps neutralize the spine. You know that the muscles that are part of the glutes, so your glute minimus, medius, and max, are also probably going to be underactive, which again is an issue. And if you're in a forward position, usually your TFL can be sometimes in an overactive position. Again, I don't know without seeing the assessment, but if your TFL is overactive, then what's going to end up happening? Remember, your TFL blends into your IT band and it crosses the knee joint. And so that's another thing that, the IT band, again, isn't overactive or underactive because it's not really a muscle, but the TFL, even though it's overactive, can still be weak. And so at that point, you want to think, what are the right muscles to inhibit and what are the right ones to strengthen? So inhibit, like the muscles that have shown to be overactive based on the compensation. So I don't know if I really answered that, and Marty, I don't know if you want to add to that, but it's just hard to say without seeing the actual results of really indicating what to do.
Okay, thank you for that explanation. And there is the contact information on the screen, but Wendy, say it out loud so that people know where to find you when this is over.
Absolutely. So if you want to email me, you can find me at wendy.bats@nasm.org, or you can find me on Instagram at wendybats13.
And Marty, where do we find you?
Email there is marty.miller@nasm.org. And then the Instagram is dr.martymiller72.
And also in some of the rough MMA gyms in South Florida. So if you want to go check him out. So thank you for everyone thank you first of all to Wendy and Marty. Good stuff today. Thank you everyone who spent this hour with us. Thanks, Greg, for keeping it all together. And we will see you actually in a couple of weeks, because next week I should be seeing some of you at Optima, our virtual Optima. So look forward to that. We'll be back here in 2 weeks.